possible draws and where equities run close together, and boards where people's ranges hit the board really hard. And I think it's particularly important in PLO because there are so many boards that are really draw heavy but play significantly differently from each other, and it's as a function of how likely it is that people's ranges hit the board. And so on boards where straight is not possible, we've got 4 examples here: a dry heavy board where there's lots of sets and top 2 pair type hands in people's ranges, not very many draws, and a really polarized dynamic at the top of ranges. This material continues onto a second slide, and so I'll get into more of the play dynamic stuff when we get to that slide. Dry light boards like Jack 6-2 Rainbow, 10-5-2 Rainbow. These are boards that both don't have very many draws, and also have a relatively low frequency of people flopping the top end of ranges. There are a lot more sort of one pair combination, or not one pair, or dryish one pair hands, or over pairs, top pair plus good kickers, these kind of hands that have more value on these boards because there just aren't that many sets in people's ranges. There aren't big draws in people's ranges, and so you sort of see a different dynamic. And the top hand, the hands that are the dominating hands that are significant in people's ranges on Ace King 9, aces, kings, Ace King. Set of 9s is a pretty high frequency set for a middle set. These hands all have a dominating relationship between each other, and they also make up a high percentage of relatively high percentage of all hands that see a flop because they're high in people's pre-flop frequencies, and also they're not vulnerable to anything. Whereas on Jack 6-2, Jack 6 is pretty vulnerable if somebody happens to flop top 2 on Jack 8-2, same type of thing. Wet heavy boards are boards that generally are flush draw boards that have a couple of Broadway cards and have a lot of straight draw possibilities, flush draw possibilities, and also have a high likelihood of people having flop top set, middle set, or lots of the big draws like Jack 10-6 with a flush draw. You've got all these King Queen 9, Ace King Queen type hands. Whereas when you go down to a wet light board like 7-5-2 with a flush draw, there are a lot more of the draw combo hands that hit that flop are not as big as the hands that hit the Jack 10-6 board. You've got some overpair plus flush draw hands, kings with a flush draw, gut shot plus flush draw, that kind of stuff. 10-9-8 with a flush draw, for example, on 7-5-2 suited. But you don't have nearly as many of those huge wrap plus flush draw type hands because people aren't playing as many 3-card combos that have 6-4-3 in them as they are three-card hands that have the 3-card combo King Queen 9 in them. Something analogous is going on with the straight boards. You start out with the dry boards or the boards, rainbow boards, where the nut straight is relatively invulnerable. A board like 9-8-7 Rainbow, there's only a gut shot to beat Jack 10. On a Jack or a 10 turn, the nuts changes to another straight. On all of the other turns, Jack 10 is still the nuts. On these Broadway boards like King Queen Jack, the nuts is going to stay Ace 10. The nut straight will stay Ace 10. The rest of the hand, regardless. Obviously, straights are always vulnerable to flushes, to flush draws, and to sets, the board pairing. And there's a lot of cases where the nuts is a flop straight, and by the river, the nuts is no longer a straight, even the quote-unquote invulnerable nut straights. But there is a significant difference between the likelihood that we end up with Ace 10 still being the nuts on the river when the board's King Queen Jack Rainbow, than the chance that 10-9 is still the nuts on the river when the board is Queen Jack 8 with a flush draw. So much more draw heavy, these wet heavy boards like Queen Jack 8, King Jack 9, and these are also boards that have a high frequency of whatever the nuts is, and also what all of the hands that run close in equity to the nuts is. So on Queen Jack 8 with a flush draw, Bear 10-9 is a pretty common hand for somebody to have, and it's also not that strong of a hand because there's a bunch of hands that are either favored over it or coin flips against it. Many of those hands are going to the ranges that they may people that are calling a bet on the flop with from somebody who has Bear 10-9. The Bear 10-9 is going to have to worry about more than just whatever outs the guy's got. He's also going to have to worry about getting bluffed with called with the nut flush draw and bluffed when the board pairs and that kind of stuff. And so the flopped bear nuts can be very difficult to play on those types of boards. just like with the straight free board examples, the wet light boards where straight is possible. Main characteristic is that there are lots of draws possible, but both the draws and the exact 2-card combination that makes the nut straight are less likely to be in people's ranges. This last comment, it's important to recognize that all of the boards where a straight is possible make the nuts more likely than boards where a straight is not possible. And so sort of the top 10% or so of range on a board like 987 Rainbow, or the top 10% of ranges on that board are all Jack 10. It's a dry board where there's really nothing that has good equity against Jack 10, and the frequency that somebody has a random 2-card combination is 7% with any unpaired 2-card combination that didn't flop a pair. And if you consider the fact that Jack 10 is going to be more common in people's ranges, it turns out to be more like 10 or 12% chance that some specific random hand that saw the flop the nuts on that board. And that's really the whole top of ranges. I mean, there's sets of 9s and 8s and 7s in ranges, obviously, and there's backdoor nut flush draws that could end up as the nuts. But there's not a whole lot other than Jack 10 that is strong on that board. You contrast that to these 632 Rainbow board. There's not much more than 5-4 that's strong on that board, but it's a lot less likely that somebody has 5-4. And then you compare the straight boards where this sort of range goes from 5% of people's preflop ranges to maybe 10 or 15%, all centered around the 7%, to a much lower percentage chance that somebody flopped the nut set when the nuts is a set. And so that impacts the sort of what the dynamic is at the top end of ranges, and sort of how aggressively you can play near nut hands. 6-5 on 987 or even 10-6 often just has to fold to a flop bet, because the prospect of facing 3 streets worth of betting from a polarized range that includes a lot of Jack 10 and can extend. If somebody has Jack 10 on 987, they're going to be able to bet all 3 streets a very high percentage of the time, still having the nuts on the river. And so if you're sitting there with some kind of non-nut hand, whether it be a hand that can't improve at all like 10-6, or a hand like 9-8 or 10-9-8, or even bottom set or whatever, you're going to face a very difficult 3-street scenario, and you can see that scenario coming from the very first pot size bet on a 3 or 4-way pot. And that's gets back into the leverage considerations. That first bet, or this either the first bet or the second bet in a certainly the second bet in a on a board like this is really heavily leveraged, because it credibly represents the nuts a high percentage of the time, and so you can get away with bluffs on these boards, so that complement the high percentage of value hands that you have, and so on. Obviously, again, there's a lot more that could be talked about here, and that we will talk about in the flop lesson, the flop videos, which are the first 2 that will follow this one, with Brian Townsend.